It is 4:20 in the afternoon on August 30th, 1862, and Captain Michael Nolan's hands are shaking. Not from fear, though he has every reason for that, but because he is trying to tear open a cartridge box that is already empty. Around him, in a ditch carved into the Virginia earth by railroad workers who never finished their job, 1,500 Confederate soldiers are reaching the same conclusion at the same moment. The cartridge boxes are empty. The cap pouches are empty. There is nothing left to fire. 30 yards away, close enough to see the brass buttons on their coats, a wave of blue uniformed Federal soldiers is still coming. They do not know the ammunition is gone. Not yet. In 60 seconds they will. Nolan looks left, looks right, sees men staring at him with mouths open, rifles clutched like clubs. This is the moment. The line holds or it doesn't. The entire left wing of Robert E. Lee's army, 24,000 men stretched along 2 miles of unfinished railroad, collapses or it doesn't. Everything Stonewall Jackson has risked in the most audacious flanking march of the Civil War comes down to what happens in the next 10 minutes. In the time it takes to walk from your front door to the end of your street, 1,500 men must find a way to stop an army with their bare hands. What they did next became one of the most mythologized moments of the entire war, and one of the most misunderstood. Because here is what no one tells you. The rocks may not have mattered at all. A Union lieutenant named Theron Haight was there. He saw the stones flying. He felt them hit, and decades later he wrote that the stones convinced him the Confederates were finished, which is why he jumped into their trench to surrender, not to fight, to ask for mercy for his wounded. The rocks didn't stop the attack. The attack was already dying. And there's a deeper question. Why was Jackson even here? Why had he marched 24,000 men 50 miles behind enemy lines, cut off from all reinforcement, and then chosen to stand still and fight an army 3 times his size? The answer is either tactical genius or suicidal arrogance. By the end of this video, you'll understand which one it was. If you're fascinated by the forgotten moments that decided America's bloodiest war, hit that subscribe button and the bell. We break down the most intense battles in history every week. Now let me take you back to Northern Virginia, August 1862, and show you how Jackson got into this impossible position. The man who ordered this gamble was Thomas Jonathan Jackson, and in August 1862, he was 38 years old, already the most feared general in the Union's nightmares. But nothing about his life before the war suggested that destiny. Orphaned at 7, raised by an uncle who worked him like a farmhand hauling stones in the hills of Western Virginia, he clawed his way into West Point and graduated near the bottom of his class. Then he became a professor, an artillery professor at the Virginia Military Institute, lecturing cadets on trajectories and Roman formations while sucking on lemons he kept in his coat pockets. His students thought he was strange. His fellow officers thought he was mediocre. His infant daughter, born that spring, had never seen him for more than a few days at a time. The army Jackson was about to fight did not know it was walking into a trap. Major General John Pope commanded the Union Army of Virginia, 65,000 men, many of them volunteers from New York and the Midwest, who'd enlisted after Fort Sumter with dreams of quick victory. By August 1862, those dreams were 18 months dead. They were tired, poorly supplied after Jackson's raid had burned their depot, and led by a general who publicly boasted that he would crush the rebellion by fall. Pope told his men the only direction he cared about was forward. He never considered that someone might get behind him. That is exactly what Jackson did. On August 26th, he took his entire corps, 24,000 men, and simply vanished. They marched north through Thoroughfare Gap, swung east and covered 50 miles in 2 days on back roads through the Blue Ridge foothills. The distance from downtown Manhattan to the Connecticut border, on foot in August heat, carrying 60 pounds of equipment. No supply wagons, no artillery reserve, nothing but rifles, cartridge boxes, and feet. By sunset on the 26th, Jackson's lead element stood at Manassas Junction. Pope's main supply base, 20 miles behind the Union Army. Pope didn't know for another 12 hours. This was not a raid. This was a bet. Jackson had placed his entire force behind an enemy 3 times his size, with no line of retreat and no guarantee that Longstreet's reinforcements, still a full day's march away, would arrive before Pope turned around and crushed him. The first thing Jackson's men did when they reached Manassas Junction was eat. They hadn't had a full meal in 3 days. What they found was beyond imagining: warehouses stacked floor to ceiling with Union supplies, barrels of salt pork, crates of coffee, boots still wrapped in paper, medical supplies, whiskey. The starving Confederates fell on it like wolves. Brigadier General Isaac Trimble's brigade overran the garrison at 4 in the morning on August 27th, sweeping aside the small Union Guard before they could telegraph a warning. But Jackson was not there for food. He was there for a fight, and specifically for a piece of ground. 2 miles north of the junction, an unfinished railroad grade cut through the Virginia countryside like a wound. The independent line of the Manassas Gap Railroad had been abandoned mid-construction, leaving a trench 10 to 20 feet deep and 10 feet wide, running ruler straight through woods and fields for 2 miles. Rough-cut Virginia sandstone lined its walls, oak and hickory crowded its edges. The smell of turned earth mixed with the metallic tang of old rail spikes. It was, Jackson realized, a ready-made fortification, a trench no one had to dig. In his official report, written days later in the clipped language of a man who measured words like ammunition, Jackson noted the capture with characteristic understatement. "We captured 8 pieces of artillery with their caissons, and 6,520 small arms were collected from the battlefield." What he did not write, what the report does not say, is that he had already decided to stay, not to raid and run, to stand. Jackson's corps numbered 24,000 men, organized in 3 divisions. Lawton's division held the center. Trimble's brigades anchored the right toward Groveton, and A.P. Hill's light division, the largest in the army, 6 brigades deep, sat 400 yards behind the line as reserve. The railroad cut gave them cover that no fieldwork could match. But cover means nothing if the enemy comes in numbers sufficient to overflow it. And the numbers were coming. Pope had 65,000 men. When he discovered Jackson behind him, he would turn the entire army around. Jackson knew this. He was counting on it. The plan, Lee's plan, required Pope to focus everything on Jackson, to pin himself against the railroad cut like a man trying to kill a wasp with his forehead. While Longstreet's 28,000 men marched through Thoroughfare Gap and hit Pope's exposed flank, but Longstreet was a day away, maybe more. Let me put this in perspective. Jackson is standing in a ditch with 24,000 men. He has deliberately placed himself behind an army of 65,000, with no escape route, no reinforcements for at least 24 hours, and one order: hold. If Longstreet is delayed, if the gap is blocked, if a bridge washes out, if a single brigade moves too slowly, Jackson's corps dies here. Every man in that trench knows it. Now let me introduce you to the men who would hold the most desperate stretch of that line. Captain Michael Nolan commanded a company of the 1st Louisiana Infantry in Stafford's brigade, the Louisiana Tigers. He was 45 years old, an Irish immigrant from County Tipperary who'd sailed to New Orleans in the 1840s as a young merchant seeking fortune. He'd fought in the Mexican War under Zachary Taylor at Monterey. Then, in 1848, consumed by the nationalism sweeping Ireland, he'd traveled back across the Atlantic with a rifle to join the Young Ireland Rebellion, and arrived too late. The uprising collapsed before he could fire a shot. Now, 14 years later, this Irishman who'd crossed an ocean for one failed revolution was about to fight for another in a ditch in Virginia, with rocks. His brigade commander was Colonel William Stafford, a different species entirely, Virginia Military Institute graduate, class of 1845, planter from Rapides Parish, Louisiana. Owned 20 slaves. an aristocrat in white gloves, commanding some of the roughest, most foul-mouthed Irishmen and Acadian French in the Confederate Army. The contrast was almost comic. It would not be comic on August 30th. On the morning of August 28th, Jackson's scouts reported Union columns moving in at least 3 directions. Pope was confused, but he was converging. Within hours, elements would make contact. Jackson had a choice. He could withdraw 5 miles west toward Gainesville, shorten his line, move closer to Longstreet's approaching column, and reduce his risk. Every principle of military science said to do this. He was outnumbered nearly 3-1. He had no supply line. His men had been marching for days. Jackson chose to stay. He rode his line that morning on his small sorrel horse, stopping at each brigade, saying little. The men watched him pass, this gaunt, lemon-sucking professor in a faded VMI kepi, and understood. They were not leaving. The railroad cut was their ground. They would hold it, or they would die in it. There was no third option. Whether Jackson articulated this reasoning to his division commanders in explicit terms, the historical record does not clearly show. What is clear is the result. Not a single regiment withdrew, not a single brigade repositioned rearward. The decision radiated down the chain of command like a current through wire. By noon on August 28th, 24,000 men had committed themselves to a 2-mile ditch with their backs against nothing. This is the part that still astonishes me. Jackson is not defending a city. He's not guarding a river crossing. He's standing in an unfinished railroad cut in the middle of nowhere, for the specific purpose of being attacked. He wants Pope to hit him. He needs Pope to hit him, because every minute Pope spends attacking Jackson is a minute Longstreet gets closer. Jackson isn't holding a position. He's holding a clock. The transition was ominous. By the afternoon of August 28th, Union probing forces made contact along the Warrenton Turnpike near Groveton. The fighting that erupted was Jackson's announcement, "I am here. Come and get me." Pope heard the message. He believed he had Jackson trapped. He ordered the full Army of Virginia to concentrate and destroy him. It was exactly what Jackson wanted, and it was going to cost his men everything they had. The first clash came at 3 in the afternoon on August 28th, when a Union division under Brigadier General Rufus King marched straight down the Warrenton Turnpike, exposed and unaware. Jackson watched them from the tree line. He let them come, closer, closer. Then he opened fire. The engagement at Groveton was not the main event, but it was the announcement. 5,000 Confederates against 8,000 Federals, slugging it out at ranges that closed to 50 yards in the August heat. It lasted 3 hours. Neither side broke. Neither side retreated. When darkness fell, the dead lay in windrows along the turnpike and the fields on either side. The Union knew now. Jackson was not running. Pope received the news at his headquarters with something close to elation. He believed, genuinely believed, that Jackson had made a fatal error, that the Confederate force was isolated, unsupported, and trapped. "We shall bag the whole crowd," he telegraphed Washington. He ordered every available corps to converge on Jackson's position. 28,000 men would attack the railroad cut the next day. What Pope did not know, what his cavalry had failed to report, was that Longstreet's 28,000 men were already threading through Thoroughfare Gap, less than a day's march from Jackson's right flank. The trap Pope thought he was springing was actually the jaws of a vice closing around his own army. But that was tomorrow's revelation. Today's problem was simpler and more brutal. Jackson had to survive. Among the Union soldiers marching toward that railroad cut, on the morning of August 29th, was First Lieutenant Theron Haight of the 24th New York Infantry. He was 22 years old. Before the war, he'd been a clerk in a New York City office, the kind of young man who wore clean collars and filed papers in alphabetical order. He'd enlisted the week after Fort Sumter, burning with the same patriotic fire that swept 1 million young men into uniform. By August 1862, 18 months of war had burned away everything except the instinct to survive. Haight did not know it yet, but he would end this battle inside the Confederate trench, not as a conqueror, but as a man seeking mercy. Think about what's happening here. A 22-year-old clerk from Manhattan is marching toward a ditch defended by a 45-year-old Irish revolutionary who once sailed across the Atlantic to fight in someone else's war. Neither knows the other exists. In 48 hours, one will throw rocks at the other's advancing line, and the other will jump into the trench to surrender. This is war at its most absurdly human. Dawn on August 29th brought the full weight of Pope's army against Jackson's line. The attacks came in waves, uncoordinated, piecemeal, brutal. First, Banks' corps hit the center, then Ricketts' division hammered the left, then King's men tried the right again near Groveton. Pope fed his divisions in one at a time, each attack separated by hours, each one met by concentrated Confederate fire from the railroad cut. The geometry was murderous for the attackers. To reach the cut, Union soldiers had to cross between 1,000 and 1,500 yards of open field, 15 football fields of grass with nothing to hide behind. No cover, no defilade, nothing but grass and the August sun, and the growing realization that the men in that ditch could see every step. The Confederates fired from the lip of the cut, their bodies protected below the chest by 10 to 20 feet of Virginia earth. It was like attacking a castle wall with no siege equipment. Here's the mathematics of this killing ground. A trained Civil War infantryman fires 3 aimed rounds per minute. Jackson has roughly 18,000 men engaged along the line. Even if only a third are firing at any given moment, that's 6,000 rifles, sending 18,000 bullets per minute into an open field. A Union brigade advancing at quick step covers 100 yards per minute. They need 10 to 15 minutes to cross. Do the math. It is slaughter. The heat was savage, 90 degrees or more by midday, with no shade in the open fields. Union soldiers advanced with wool uniforms soaked through, canteens empty by noon, throats so parched that some men tore open paper cartridges with hands instead of teeth, because their mouths were too dry. The Confederates in the cut were no better. Many had been marching or fighting for 4 consecutive days. Their lips cracked, their shoulders ached from the recoil of 100 rounds fired. The black powder smoke hung in the still August air like fog, turning the railroad cut into a sulphur-choked canyon where men could barely see the man next to them. But they held. All day, August 29th cost Pope thousands of casualties and gained him nothing. Not 1 yard of that railroad cut changed hands. Jackson's line bent in places. Hill's reserve division was committed twice to plug gaps, but it never broke. And here is the terrible thing. Longstreet arrived at noon on August 29th. 28,000 fresh Confederate troops, extending Jackson's right flank by 3 miles. Lee had his whole army united now. The vise was ready to close, but Lee held Longstreet back. He waited. He let Pope attack again, because every division Pope threw at Jackson's ditch was a division that wasn't watching its own left flank. Pope still didn't know Longstreet was there. The night of August 29th brought no rest. Jackson's ammunition wagons worked through the darkness, distributing cartridges to units that had fired 100 rounds or more that day. But the wagons were not bottomless. The supply that had seemed adequate for a one-day stand was being consumed at a rate no one had planned for. Jackson's men would go into August 30th with partial loads, some units carrying 60 rounds per man, some carrying 40, some carrying less. It was not enough, not for what was coming. August 30th dawned clear and hot. For the first time in 3 days, the morning was quiet. No Union drums, no advancing columns, just birdsong and the distant murmur of tens of thousands of men preparing. Jackson used the hours. Ammunition was redistributed. Units that had seen less action on the 29th passed cartridges to those on the front line. But it was robbing Peter to pay Paul. The total supply was finite, and 3 days of fighting had drawn it down to dangerous levels. Some companies in Stafford's and Johnson's brigades, the units holding the most exposed stretch of the cut, the section closest to the Union concentration, received only 40 to 60 rounds per man. A single intense firefight could burn through that in 15 minutes. Jackson rode the line again that morning. He said nothing recorded. But the men in the cut, the same men who'd gorged on Union stores 3 days earlier, watched him pass and tightened their grip on rifles they might not be able to feed much longer. The silence felt wrong, not peaceful, pressurized, like the moment between lightning and thunder. At 3 in the afternoon, it broke. Pope had spent the morning convincing himself that Jackson was retreating. Dust clouds behind the Confederate line, actually ammunition wagons and ambulances, looked to Pope like a withdrawal. He ordered a pursuit. What he actually ordered was a full frontal assault by 28,000 men against a fortified position manned by defenders who had no intention of leaving. The Union formations emerged from the tree line in brigade strength, flags flying, drums beating, officers on horseback. From the railroad cut, the Confederates watched them come. 1,500 yards away, 1,000 yards. At 800 yards, Confederate artillery opened. Captured Union guns now turned against their former owners. Shells burst in the advancing ranks, tearing gaps that closed immediately as men stepped over the fallen. Within minutes, the smoke was so thick that Haight, advancing with the 24th New York somewhere in that blue tide, later wrote that he could not see the enemy position 50 yards ahead. The field dissolved into a choking grey fog lit by muzzle flashes. Men navigated by sound, the crash of volley fire ahead, the screams to the left, the officers' voices shouting forward through raw throats. The first Union wave hit the railroad cut at approximately 3:30. The effect was instantaneous and catastrophic. Confederate fire from the cut, concentrated downhill, at ranges closing from 200 yards to 50, shredded the advancing lines. Whole companies went down together, but they kept coming. Pope had committed too many men to stop. The pressure was enormous, continuous, rolling like a wave that never quite broke but never quite receded. This is the part where the arithmetic stops being abstract. Every minute, the men in that cut are firing 3 rounds. Every minute, they have 3 fewer rounds left. The Union assault isn't going to stop. Pope has 28,000 men. He can feed fresh brigades into this attack for hours. Jackson's men cannot manufacture ammunition. The clock that Jackson chose to hold is now counting down, and the number it's counting to is 0. By 4 in the afternoon, 30 minutes into the main assault, the first reports of ammunition exhaustion reached Jackson's headquarters. Units on the left center of the line, the brigades of Stafford and Johnson holding the stretch of cut nearest the heaviest Union pressure, began sending runners back with the same message: cartridge boxes empty. No reserves. The crisis materialized with terrifying speed. These men had been firing at rates of 100 to 200 rounds per minute per company, more lead flying than a modern machine gun, from men loading 1 bullet at a time, because the enemy was so close and so dense that aimed fire was unnecessary. They simply pointed into the blue mass and pulled triggers. 40 rounds per man vanished in 20 minutes. Bradley T. Johnson commanded the brigade next to Stafford's. He was 35, a Maryland lawyer from Frederick who had been disowned by his own Unionist father for choosing secession. His wife had organized a company of soldiers and sewn the first Confederate flag to fly in Maryland. Now this man without a family held a stretch of ditch without ammunition, and the choice was brutally simple: run, surrender, or improvise. Johnson's men reached for the ground. The railroad cut, never completed, was littered with the debris of its own construction: chunks of Virginia sandstone, loose rocks, pieces of grading fill. Men picked up stones the size of baseballs, the size of fists. Stop and think about what's happening in this ditch. These are not primitives. These are men with Enfield rifles, men who 3 days ago captured 8 artillery pieces and 6,000 modern weapons. And now they're reaching for rocks. They've been pushed past the edge of industrial warfare, back into something older than gunpowder. This is not a battle anymore. This is survival. Stafford's Louisiana men reached the same point seconds later. The first, Louisiana. The second, Louisiana. Irish dock workers from New Orleans. Acadian farmers from the bayou. Men whose legs had already carried them 50 miles in 2 days, who'd eaten captured Yankee rations, fired 100 rounds or more in 3 days of combat, and now held nothing in their hands except what the earth offered. The Union line was 30 yards away, close enough to see faces, close enough to hear individual voices shouting orders in English that sounded just like their own. Captain Michael Nolan, the Irishman who'd once crossed an ocean for a fight, the man who'd sailed to Ireland for a revolution that never happened, looked at his empty-handed men and made a decision that would echo for a century and a half. He did not order a retreat. He did not order a surrender. He did not order a bayonet charge. He shouted, "Boys, give them rocks." The words carried down the line. Men who'd been frozen by the impossibility of their situation suddenly had permission to act. Rocks flew, chunks of sandstone, pieces of railroad grading, loose stones ripped from the earth. They arced across 30 yards of Virginia air and crashed into the advancing Union line. The throwing lasted 10 to 15 minutes, in the time it takes to brew a pot of coffee. 1,500 men, Stafford's brigade and Johnson's brigade together, standing in a ditch hurling stones at a modern army equipped with Springfield rifles and bayonets. The image is almost prehistoric. Men screaming, arms windmilling, rocks cracking against kepis and shoulders and raised arms. From the Union side, the sight must have been incomprehensible. What kind of men throw rocks at rifles? Haight, advancing with the 24th New York, later described the stones rattling like hail. They struck, they hurt, they drew blood. But they did not kill. Not like the bullets that were still coming from other parts of the line where ammunition hadn't yet run dry. The rocks were terrifying in their desperation, but their lethality was negligible. A stone at 30 yards bruises, a Minié ball at 30 yards removes limbs, but the rocks did something bullets could not. They communicated. They told the Union officers something critical. These men are out of ammunition. They are finished. They cannot hurt you anymore. This should have been the moment of breakthrough. This should have been the moment the Union line surged forward and overwhelmed 1,500 defenseless men. But here's the thing about an army. It isn't a single brain. It's 10,000 brains making 10,000 calculations at once. And by 4:30, many of those brains had been calculating for 90 minutes under constant fire. The attack wasn't being pushed forward by fresh energy. It was stumbling forward on momentum alone. And momentum, unlike courage, has a half-life. At 4:47, roughly 10 minutes after the rock-throwing began, the sound came from behind. Not the crash of Union fire, but the rebel yell, high-pitched, keening animal. The men in the cut turned their heads and saw what they'd been dying for. Hood's Texas Brigade, running at a dead sprint, emerging from the tree line 500 yards behind the cut after a 2-mile forced march. Like running from one end of Central Park to the other at full speed in full kit, Hood's men didn't stop at the cut. They poured over it, through it, past the exhausted Louisianans and Virginians, and slammed into the Union advance like a freight train hitting a stalled car. Fresh troops, full cartridge boxes, clean rifles. The effect was instantaneous. The Union advance, already wavering, already bled white by 90 minutes of frontal assault against a fortified position, shattered. The Federal line didn't retreat. It dissolved. Men who'd been inching forward for an hour and a half suddenly found fresh Confederate soldiers sprinting at them with bayonets and full lungs. The psychological shock was absolute. Units that had maintained cohesion for the entire advance broke apart in seconds. Men ran. Officers couldn't stop them. This is what Jackson was holding for. Not for the rocks to work, not for a miracle, for time. Every minute his men spent in that cut, firing, then praying, then throwing stones, was a minute that Hood's brigade was covering ground. 10 minutes, 15 minutes. The rocks didn't need to stop the Union Army. They just needed to slow it down long enough for the real answer to arrive. And then the world split open. At almost the same moment Hood hit the Union center. The entire right wing of the Confederate Army, Longstreet's 25,000 men, hidden for a full day on Pope's exposed left flank, surged forward. The counterattack that Lee had been holding like a compressed spring since noon on August 29th, finally released. 25,000 fresh Confederate troops swept 2 miles across the field in 90 minutes. Pope's army, its attention fixed on the railroad cut, its left flank hanging in air, never saw it coming. The Battle of Second Manassas didn't end with Jackson's stand. It ended with Longstreet's hammer. But the hammer only worked because the anvil held. The Union Army broke, not everywhere at once, not the way it breaks in movies, but in pieces, corps by corps, brigade by brigade, as Longstreet's wave rolled across the field from south to north. By 5 in the afternoon, the formations that had spent the day attacking the cut were being hit from behind and from the flank simultaneously. Units that had been facing west suddenly had Confederate fire coming from the south. Officers tried to reform lines that no longer existed. Some brigades held together and retreated in order toward Bull Run and the bridges beyond. Others simply disintegrated, men streaming east with no formation and no purpose except survival. Pope's army had walked into the same ground where it had been humiliated 13 months earlier at First Bull Run. The symmetry was cruel and deliberate. Lee had chosen this battlefield, Jackson had chosen this ditch, and Pope had obliged them both by attacking exactly where and when they wanted him to. In the railroad cut itself, the aftermath was surreal. Lieutenant Theron Haight, the young clerk from New York, had seen the stones flying and reached a conclusion. He understood, perhaps faster than his superiors, what the rock-throwing meant. These men had nothing left. They were defenseless. And so, in one of the war's stranger moments of human calculation, Haight jumped into the Confederate trench. Not to fight, not to capture ground, to surrender and ask for aid for his wounded comrades lying in the field behind him. Years later, writing for a historical society, Haight recalled the moment with remarkable clarity. He wrote that the stone-throwing helped him to conclude that the Confederates were out of ammunition and even prompted him to jump into the railroad cut to surrender and ask for aid for his wounded comrades. He noted that most wounds, he observed, were from bullets, not stones. The rocks had been terrifying, visible, dramatic. But the actual killing, even in those final minutes, was done by lead. So there is the answer to the mystery planted at the beginning. Did the rocks stop the Union attack? No. The attack was already spent. Haight saw it from the inside, men staggering forward on willpower alone, their ranks so thinned by 90 minutes of fire that no real breakthrough force remained. The rocks were the visible symbol of the Confederate crisis, but the Union crisis was just as severe. Both sides had reached the breaking point simultaneously. Hood's arrival, not Nolan's stones, tipped the balance. And why did Jackson stand here? Because he was the bait. The anvil doesn't swing, it holds. Every hour Pope spent hammering at the railroad cut was an hour Pope's left flank stood naked for Longstreet. Jackson didn't need to win his fight. He needed to survive it. The rocks, the stones, the bare-handed desperation, none of it was wasted. It bought the final 10 minutes that Longstreet needed to position 25,000 men for a blow that Pope never saw coming. That is not suicidal arrogance. That is strategy at its most cold-blooded. Strategy that asks men to throw rocks and die if necessary so that the larger plan survives. The bill came due in bodies. Confederate losses across the 3 days of Second Manassas: 9,200 men, 1,300 killed outright, 7,900 wounded, many of whom would die in the coming weeks. Union losses: 1700 killed, 8,500 wounded, and 4,200 captured or missing. In total, 25,000 Americans fell in 3 days on ground that had already drunk blood 13 months before. A small American city wiped out. Michael Nolan walked out of the railroad cut that evening, untouched. The Irishman who'd crossed an ocean for a revolution, who'd fought in Mexico, who'd armed himself for a rebellion in Tipperary that ended before he arrived, survived the most desperate moment of his war by shouting 4 words. He would fight on for another year before being captured at Gettysburg in July 1863. He spent the rest of the war in a Union prison camp. After the war, he returned to New Orleans, resumed his merchant business, and died in 1883. His obituary did not mention the rocks. Colonel William Stafford, the VMI aristocrat commanding Rough Irishman, survived Second Manassas but was wounded at Chancellorsville the following spring. His health never recovered. He resigned his commission in 1864 and returned to his plantation in Louisiana, where he practiced law until his death in 1877. The man who'd ordered his brigade to throw stones like schoolyard boys never discussed the moment publicly. Haight was exchanged and returned to service. He finished the war as a captain. In the decades after, he wrote his account of the rock throwing, the only detailed Union description of those 10 minutes, and in doing so became the primary witness against the myth that the rocks alone saved Jackson's line. A clerk's precision, applied to memory, undid a legend. News of the disaster reached Washington by August 31st. Panic swept the capital. Pope was relieved of command within days, sent to Minnesota to fight the Dakota War, which was the Army's way of saying his career was over. Second Manassas was Lee's masterpiece, and Jackson's martyrdom. The professor who taught artillery theory at VMI had positioned his men like a Roman testudo, shields up, absorbing blow after blow, while the killing stroke came from the flank. It was textbook. Except the textbook doesn't mention what it costs the men inside the formation. The textbook doesn't mention the moment the ammunition runs out and you ask men to throw rocks. Here is what most accounts leave out. Historian John Hennessy, after exhaustive study of both Union and Confederate primary sources, concluded that while this stone pitching reflected the intensity of the fighting, it in fact had no bearing on the outcome of the attack. By the time Stafford's and Johnson's men resorted to these desperate tactics, the Federal attack was spent and Confederate reinforcements had arrived. The rocks have become the iconic image of the battle, the moment every painting captures, every textbook features, every documentary dramatizes. But they were theater, not tactics. The real story is not 1,500 men throwing stones. The real story is 1,500 men standing in a ditch for 3 days because one man told them to stay, and they did. The myth served both sides. For the Confederacy, it proved the superiority of Southern valor over Northern material advantage, men who would fight with their bare hands rather than surrender. For the Union, it explained away the defeat. How do you beat men who fight like that? Both interpretations obscure the truth. That Second Manassas was decided by timing, logistics, and John Pope's catastrophic failure of intelligence. Jackson's stand was essential. The rocks were not. Jackson himself survived Second Manassas untouched, the same eerie invulnerability that had earned him his nickname at First Bull Run. 8 months later, at Chancellorsville, riding his own lines at dusk to organize a night attack, he was shot 3 times by his own men, North Carolina infantry, who mistook his party for Union cavalry. His left arm was amputated. He developed pneumonia. On May 10, 1863, the professor from VMI died in a small house in Guinea Station, Virginia. His last words, "Let us cross over the river and rest under the shade of the trees." The man who told his men to hold a ditch could not hold his own life. Walk the Manassas battlefield today, 1 million visitors do each year, and you can still see the railroad cut. It's shallower now, partially filled by a century and a half of erosion and fallen leaves. But stand in it, and you can still feel the geometry, the open field stretching away, the slight elevation that gave the defenders their angle, the depth that sheltered them. And if you pick up a stone from the Virginia earth, the same sandstone those men grabbed in their desperation, you'll find it fits in your hand perfectly. It weighs nothing. It means nothing as a weapon. It meant everything as a statement. They did not leave. That was the message the rocks sent. Not, "We can hurt you," but "We will die here." If this story moved you, subscribe for more. We cover the battles that shaped history every week. I'll see you next time.